My name is Ryan Matthews, and I want you to remember that name because by the end of this story, everyone else certainly will. The night they destroyed my life was December 24th, and the snow was falling so hard you could barely see the streetlights through my office window. I should have been home wrapping presents or drinking hot chocolate with someone who loved me, but instead I was staring at termination papers while my boss smiled like he was giving me the gift of a lifetime. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights in Peterson and Associates hummed their usual tired song as I packed the last of my personal belongings into a cardboard box that smelled like old coffee and broken dreams. 5 years of my life reduced to a stapler, a coffee mug with a crack down the side, and a photo of me shaking hands with the mayor when we landed the Riverside Development contract. That contract alone brought the firm over $2 million in revenue, but apparently that didn't matter when James Peterson decided he needed a scapegoat for the Henderson project delays. Peterson stood in the doorway of what used to be my office, his expensive suit perfectly pressed despite the late hour, watching me like I was some kind of entertainment. His silver hair was slicked back the way rich men do when they want everyone to know they can afford the good pomade, and his smile never quite reached his eyes. Those cold blue eyes that had looked right through me when he delivered the news 30 minutes ago. Budget cuts, he had said. Nothing personal, Ryan, just business. We have to make some difficult decisions, and unfortunately your position has become redundant. The words felt rehearsed, like he'd practiced them in front of his bathroom mirror while shaving that morning. What he didn't say was that his nephew Bradley, fresh out of college with zero experience and a trust fund, was starting Monday in my old position with a salary 20% higher than mine had been. I sealed the box with packing tape and hefted it under my arm. The weight of it surprised me. 5 years, and this was all I had to show for it. Peterson stepped aside as I walked past him, but not before he delivered his parting shot. "Merry Christmas, Ryan. I'm sure you'll land on your feet somewhere." His tone was casual, almost friendly, like he was commenting on the weather instead of destroying my career 3 days before Christmas. Maybe this will be a blessing in disguise. Sometimes we all need a push to find our true calling. I stopped at the elevator bank and turned to look at him one last time. He was already walking back toward his corner office, probably to pour himself another scotch from that crystal decanter he kept on his desk like some kind of trophy. The elevator dinged, and I stepped inside without saying a word. Some conversations aren't worth having, and besides, I had bigger problems waiting for me at home. The drive through downtown Denver was eerily quiet for a Friday night, but then again most normal people were tucked away somewhere warm with their families, not driving through a blizzard after getting fired on Christmas Eve. The radio played nothing but holiday songs, so I turned it off and drove in silence, listening to the rhythmic scrape of my windshield wipers fighting against the snow. Each stroke sounded like a countdown timer, marking the seconds until I'd have to face my father with the news. Dad had always made his feelings about my career choice crystal clear. Real estate development was for dreamers and fools, he'd say, lighting another cigarette and shaking his head like I'd just told him I wanted to join the circus. Real men worked with their hands, built things that lasted, things you could touch and see, not pushing papers around and pretending that pretty pictures and fancy presentations meant anything in the real world. He worked construction for 37 years before his back gave out, and he wore that like a badge of honor, like suffering through physical labor somehow made him more authentic than the rest of us. My childhood home sat at the end of Maple Street like a tired old dog that had seen better days. The paint was peeling around the window frames, and the front porch sagged slightly on the left side where the foundation had settled unevenly over the years. Dad always said he'd fix it someday, but someday had come and gone about 15 years ago. The Christmas lights strung along the roofline flickered sporadically, half of them burned out and the other half hanging on by sheer stubborn will. I sat in my car for a few minutes, engine running, heater blasting, trying to work up the courage to go inside. Through the living room window, I could see the blue glow of the television and Dad's silhouette in his recliner, probably watching old westerns and drinking beer straight from the bottle the way he'd done every night for as long as I could remember. Mom would have made him use a glass, would have insisted on coasters and napkins and all the little civilized touches that kept a house from feeling like just a place where someone happened to sleep. But Mom had been gone for 3 years now, and Dad had let those gentle standards slip away along with everything else. The snow crunched under my boots as I walked up the front path, carrying my pathetic cardboard box like some kind of offering to the gods of failure. I didn't knock, just turned the handle and stepped inside. The house smelled like stale cigarette smoke and the lingering ghost of the meatloaf he'd heated up for dinner. Dad looked up from his chair, took one look at the box in my arms, and I watched his expression shift from mild curiosity to something that looked almost like satisfaction. "Well, well," he said, muting the television with the remote. "Let me guess. The big-shot real estate developer finally got what was coming to him." He took a long pull from his beer bottle and set it down on the table beside his chair, the sound of glass meeting wood echoing in the quiet room. "I knew this day would come, Ryan. I just didn't think it would happen quite so soon." I set the box down by the front door and shrugged out of my coat, hanging it on the hook where Mom used to hang her sweaters. The house felt different without her presence, colder somehow, like all the warmth had been sucked out through the walls the day we buried her. Dad had never been the emotional type, but losing Mom had hardened him even further, turned him into something sharp and brittle that could cut you if you got too close. "They let me go," I said, not because I wanted to give him the satisfaction of hearing me say it, but because I knew he'd keep guessing until I told him anyway. "Budget cuts," they said. But really, the boss wanted to make room for his nephew. Dad nodded slowly, like this confirmed everything he'd always suspected about my chosen profession. "Nepotism," he said, dragging the word out like it tasted bad in his mouth. "That's what happens when you trust your future to people who never had to work for anything. You think some rich boy in a fancy suit was ever going to look out for you? You think loyalty means anything to people like that?" He reached for another beer from the cooler beside his chair, popped it open with a bottle opener that had been a promotional item from some long-defunct tool company. The foam hissed and overflowed slightly, dripping onto his fingers. He wiped them on his shirt without seeming to notice. "You know what I think, Ryan? I think this is the best thing that could have happened to you. Maybe now you'll stop chasing after fairy tales and find yourself some honest work. My buddy Pete knows a foreman over at Morrison Construction. They're always looking for guys who aren't afraid to get their hands dirty. Might be time for you to learn what real work feels like." I looked around the living room, taking in the worn furniture and the water stain on the ceiling that had been there since I was in high school. The Christmas tree sat in the corner, a sad little 4-foot pine with maybe 24 ornaments scattered across its branches. Most of them were handmade things I'd crafted in elementary school, construction paper angels and popsicle stick snowflakes that Mom had saved in a shoebox and brought out every December. Dad had put them up this year, probably more out of habit than sentiment. "Construction work," I said, not really a question but not quite agreeing either. "That's your solution to everything, isn't it, Dad? When I didn't make the baseball team in high school, you wanted me to get a job framing houses. When I struggled with calculus in college, you suggested I drop out and learn electrical work. And now that I've hit a bump in my career, here you are again with the same old answer." Dad's jaw tightened, and he leaned forward in his chair, setting his beer down with a little more force than necessary. "Don't you dare take that tone with me, boy. I worked my ass off to keep a roof over your head and food on this table. I paid for your college education even though I thought it was a waste of money, and I never once asked you to pay me back. So don't sit there in your fancy clothes and act like I don't know what I'm talking about." He stood up from his chair, and even at 62 years old, even with the bad back and the gray hair and the slight stoop in his shoulders, he was still an intimidating presence. Dad had always been a big man, 6'3" and broad through the chest, with hands that looked like they could crush walnuts without much effort. Age had softened him somewhat, but there was still strength there, still that coiled energy of someone who'd spent decades doing physical labor. "You want to know what your real problem is, Ryan?"
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"You've never faced any real adversity. Everything came easy to you in school. You got that fancy degree, landed a job right out of college making more money than I ever saw in a year. You never learned how to fight for anything because you never had to. Well, welcome to the real world, son. Sometimes life knocks you down, and you have to decide whether you're going to get back up or just lie there feeling sorry for yourself." I felt something hot and angry rising in my chest, but I pushed it down. Getting into a shouting match with Dad on Christmas Eve wasn't going to solve anything, and besides, part of me wondered if maybe he was right. Maybe I had been living in some kind of bubble, insulated from the harsh realities that people like him faced every day. Maybe losing my job was exactly the wake-up call I needed. But another part of me, a smaller but more insistent voice, whispered that Dad didn't know the whole story. He didn't know about the side projects I'd been working on, the connections I'd made, the plans I'd been quietly putting together while everyone else assumed I was just another corporate drone counting down the days to retirement. He didn't know about the investment group in Seattle that had been courting me for months, or the property development opportunity in Portland that I'd been researching in my spare time. He saw failure where I saw possibility, and maybe that said more about him than it did about me. Good riddance, Dad continued, settling back into his chair like he'd delivered some profound wisdom. Maybe now you can stop pretending to be something you're not and find some honest work. Your mother always worried that all that fancy education was going to ruin you, make you think you were too good for regular folks. Looks like she might have been right. Mentioning Mom was a low blow, and he knew it. She had been proud of my education, proud of my job, proud that her son was making something of himself in ways she'd never been able to imagine. She used to brag to her friends at the grocery store about her son, the real estate developer, how he wore suits to work and had his own office and dealt with important people making important decisions. She never lived to see me succeed the way I'd planned, but she believed in me when nobody else did. I picked up my cardboard box and headed toward the stairs that led up to my old bedroom. This conversation wasn't going anywhere productive, and I needed time to think, to process what had happened, and figure out my next move. Dad could sit there in his chair judging me all he wanted, but I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break down. "That's right, run away," Dad called after me, "just like you always do when things get tough. But you can't run from reality forever, Ryan. Sooner or later, you're going to have to face the truth about yourself." I stopped at the bottom of the stairs and turned back to look at him. "The truth about myself," I said quietly. "What truth is that, Dad? That you're just like every other entitled kid who thought the world owed him something. You never learned how to fail, so you never learned how to succeed. And now that life has finally knocked you down a peg, you don't know how to handle it." I climbed the stairs without responding, each step creaking under my weight in a rhythm I remembered from childhood. My old bedroom was exactly as I'd left it 3 years ago when I'd moved out into my own apartment. The twin bed with its faded blue comforter, the desk where I'd done homework and written college application essays, the bookshelf full of paperbacks and textbooks I'd never opened again after graduation. Mom had wanted to turn it into a sewing room, but Dad had insisted on leaving it as it was, like some kind of shrine to my childhood. I set the cardboard box on the desk and sat down on the edge of the bed, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline from the confrontation with Peterson had long since faded, replaced by a bone-deep weariness that made my whole body feel heavy. Outside my window, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the neighborhood in pristine white that would be gray and slushy by morning. The truth was, Dad wasn't entirely wrong. I had been coasting for the past few years, doing good work but not great work, collecting my paycheck and going through the motions without really pushing myself to excel. Peterson and Associates was a mid-tier firm that specialized in small commercial developments and residential subdivisions, the kind of safe, predictable projects that generated steady revenue without requiring much creativity or innovation. I'd been comfortable there, maybe too comfortable, but what Dad didn't understand, what nobody understood, was that comfort had been a choice, not a limitation. While he saw stagnation, I saw patience. While he saw complacency, I saw preparation. For the past 2 years, I'd been quietly building something much bigger than my day job, something that nobody at Peterson and Associates knew anything about, something that nobody in my family knew anything about, for that matter. I opened my laptop and logged into an encrypted email account that I'd set up 18 months ago, using a secure server in Switzerland. The inbox contained 47 messages, most of them from the past week, all of them related to a project that was about to change everything. The subject lines told the story. Final environmental clearance approved, zoning variance granted, investment consortium ready to proceed, construction permits filed and accepted. Riverside Commons was my baby, a mixed-use development project that would transform 12 acres of abandoned industrial property on the outskirts of Denver into a vibrant community of retail, office, and residential space. I'd identified the property during a routine drive through an older part of town, noticed how the abandoned warehouses sat right at the intersection of 3 major transportation corridors, perfectly positioned to take advantage of the city's westward growth pattern. The owners were a family trust that had inherited the property from their grandfather, a steel fabricator who'd closed his business in the 1980s when cheaper foreign competition made his operation unprofitable. The buildings had been sitting empty for nearly 20 years, slowly deteriorating, while the family paid property taxes and hoped someone would eventually make them an offer they couldn't refuse. They had no idea what they were sitting on. I spent 6 months researching comparable properties, studying traffic patterns, analyzing demographic trends, and building relationships with city planners and zoning officials. I learned that the city had been quietly planning a light rail extension that would run right past the property, turning it from an isolated industrial site into a prime transit-oriented development opportunity. The rail line wouldn't break ground for another 3 years, but savvy developers were already positioning themselves to take advantage of the inevitable transformation. The breakthrough came when I met Sarah Chen, a civil engineer who'd recently left her job at the city planning department to start her own consulting firm. Sarah had worked on the preliminary designs for the light rail extension, and she understood better than anyone how the new transit infrastructure would reshape the entire corridor. More importantly, she had connections throughout the development community and access to capital sources that were completely outside my normal network. Sarah introduced me to Marcus Webb, a private equity investor who specialized in urban redevelopment projects. Marcus had made his fortune buying undervalued properties in transitioning neighborhoods, holding them through the gentrification process, and selling them at massive profits once the areas became fashionable. He was looking for local partners who understood the Denver market and could identify opportunities before they became obvious to everyone else. The three of us formed Matthews Development Group 6 months ago, with me holding a 40% stake, Marcus contributing 60% of the initial capital, and Sarah serving as our primary contractor and technical consultant. We structured the deal so that I maintained operational control while Marcus provided the financial backing and Sarah handled the engineering challenges. It was exactly the kind of partnership I'd always dreamed of, but I'd kept it completely separate from my day job at Peterson and Associates. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. We would acquire the Riverside property for $800,000, significantly below market value because the current owners had no idea what it would be worth once the light rail line was announced. We'd spend another $2 million on environmental remediation and infrastructure improvements, then develop the property in phases over a 4-year period. The first phase would be a small office complex and retail strip that would generate immediate cash flow. The second phase would add residential units once the transit line construction was underway. By the time the rail line opened, we'd own 12 acres of prime commercial real estate in one of Denver's fastest-growing corridors. Conservative projections suggested we'd triple our initial investment within 5 years. Aggressive projections, based on comparable properties in similar markets, suggested we could do much better than that. Either way, my 40% stake would be worth significantly more than anything I could ever earn working for someone else, even if I'd stayed at Peterson and Associates for the next 20 years. The best part was that nobody knew about it. Not Peterson, not my coworkers, not my family. I'd been careful to conduct all my business through the LLC, using a separate phone number and email address, meeting with partners and contractors during lunch breaks or on weekends. As far as anyone knew, I was just another mid-level employee putting in my time and collecting my paycheck. I opened the most recent email from Marcus, sent just 3 hours ago while I was cleaning out my desk. The environmental impact study had been completed ahead of schedule, and all the regulatory approvals were in place. The property acquisition was scheduled to close on January 15th, less than 3 weeks away. After that, we'd begin the first phase of construction, starting with the remediation work that would prepare the site for development. My phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah. Heard about Peterson through the grapevine.
Coffee tomorrow morning?
We need to talk about timing. Sarah was plugged into the local development community in ways I'd never been able to match during my years at Peterson and Associates. She heard about personnel changes, contract awards, and zoning decisions days or sometimes weeks before they became public knowledge. If she'd already heard about my termination, it would be common knowledge throughout the industry by Monday morning. I typed back a quick response. 10 a.m. at Stella's on Colfax. We'll figure it out. The irony wasn't lost on me. Peterson had fired me on Christmas Eve thinking he was destroying my career, but he'd actually freed me to pursue something much more ambitious than anything I could have accomplished while working for him. I'd been planning to give my notice in February anyway, once the Riverside acquisition was complete and I could transition into running Matthews Development Group full-time. Now I could start immediately, without the distraction of trying to balance two competing priorities. Still, the sting of rejection was real. Being fired was different from quitting, no matter how ready you were to leave. It was a judgment on your character, your competence, your value as a human being. Peterson might have thought he was making a simple business decision, but he'd sent a message that resonated far beyond the walls of his office. Ryan Matthews wasn't good enough, wasn't essential, wasn't worth keeping around when tough choices had to be made. That message would follow me for the rest of my career, unless I did something to change the narrative. People in the Denver development community would hear about my termination from Peterson and Associates, and they'd draw their own conclusions about why it happened. They'd assume I'd screwed up a project, or failed to meet my numbers, or somehow disappointed my employer in ways that made me unemployable. The truth about budget cuts and nepotism would get lost in the rumor mill, replaced by speculation and gossip that could damage my reputation for years to come. Unless Matthew's development group succeeded so spectacularly that nobody cared about ancient history. Unless Riverside Commons became such an obvious success that Peterson would spend the rest of his career explaining why he'd let me go. Unless I proved beyond any possible doubt that his judgment had been catastrophically wrong. I closed the laptop and lay back on my childhood bed, staring up at a ceiling that hadn't been painted since I was in middle school. Somewhere in the house I could hear Dad moving around, probably getting ready for bed, or maybe just restless from too much beer and too much anger. He'd wake up tomorrow morning with a hangover and the satisfaction of knowing he'd been right about my failure. He'd spend Christmas Day telling anyone who'd listen that his son had finally gotten what was coming to him, that all those years of education and ambition had amounted to nothing more than a cardboard box full of office supplies. But Dad didn't know what I knew. He didn't know about the property acquisition, or the investment consortium, or the light rail line that would transform 12 acres of abandoned warehouses into the most valuable commercial real estate in the city. He didn't know that his son had been playing a much longer, much more sophisticated game than anyone realized. The snow had stopped falling, and through my bedroom window I could see stars beginning to appear between the breaking clouds. Christmas morning was still hours away, but I felt like I'd already received the only gift I needed: clarity. The comfortable illusion of job security was gone, but in its place was something much more valuable: the freedom to pursue my real ambitions without compromise or distraction. I thought about Peterson, probably asleep in his expensive house in Cherry Hills Village, dreaming about the money he'd save by replacing me with his incompetent nephew. I thought about Bradley Peterson, 22 years old and fresh out of college, preparing to step into a role he wasn't qualified to fill. I thought about all the clients and contractors who'd trusted me with their business, who'd wake up Monday morning to discover they'd be working with someone who didn't understand their needs or their industries. Most of all, I thought about the conversation I'd have with Sarah tomorrow morning, when I'd finally be able to tell someone about the plan I'd been nurturing in secret for so many months. She'd understand better than anyone what this opportunity meant, not just financially but professionally. She'd see the same potential I saw, the chance to build something lasting and important instead of just collecting a paycheck and waiting for retirement. Outside my window, Denver slept under its blanket of fresh snow, unaware that everything was about to change. In 3 weeks, Matthew's development group would own 12 acres of prime real estate. In 6 months, we'd break ground on the first phase of construction. In 2 years, we'd be generating more revenue than Peterson and Associates had ever seen in their best year. And in 5 years, when the light rail line opened and Riverside Commons was the crown jewel of Denver's transit-oriented development boom, everyone would remember this night differently. They'd remember it as the beginning of something extraordinary, not the end of something ordinary. They'd remember Christmas Eve 2023 as the night Ryan Matthews stopped working for other people and started building an empire of his own. But first, I had to survive tomorrow morning's conversation with Dad, who'd wake up expecting to find his unemployed son ready to accept defeat and start over at the bottom of someone else's ladder. He had no idea that his son had already built his own ladder, rung by rung, in complete secrecy. He had no idea that everything he thought he knew about failure and success was about to be turned upside down. I pulled the covers up to my chin and closed my eyes, listening to the old house settling around me like a living thing, adjusting to the weight of accumulated secrets. In a few hours, the sun would rise on Christmas morning, and the real work would begin. Christmas morning arrived with the kind of crystalline silence that only comes after a heavy snowfall. I woke before dawn, my internal clock still programmed for early morning meetings and conference calls that no longer existed. The house was quiet except for the familiar sounds of Dad moving around downstairs, probably making coffee and wondering how he was going to spend Christmas Day with his unemployed son. I showered and dressed carefully, choosing clothes that struck the right balance between professional and casual. Today wasn't about impressing anyone, but it wasn't about surrendering either. Sarah had texted me again at 6 in the morning, suggesting we move our meeting to her office instead of the coffee shop. More privacy, she'd written. We have things to discuss that shouldn't be overheard. Dad was sitting at the kitchen table when I came downstairs, nursing a cup of black coffee and reading yesterday's newspaper like nothing had changed. The sports section was spread out in front of him, but I could tell he wasn't really absorbing the content. His eyes kept drifting toward the window, toward the snow-covered street where neighbors were starting to emerge from their houses with snow shovels and winter coats. "Morning," I said, pouring myself coffee from the pot he'd made. The brew was strong and bitter, the way he'd always liked it, the way Mom had learned to tolerate it during their 35 years of marriage. He looked up from his paper, studying my face like he was trying to read something written there in invisible ink. "You sleep at all last night?" he asked. "You look like hell." "I slept fine," I lied, taking a seat across from him at the table. The kitchen looked smaller than I remembered, the appliances older and more tired. The refrigerator hummed with a mechanical wheeze that suggested it was living on borrowed time, and the linoleum floor showed wear patterns from decades of daily traffic. Dad folded his newspaper and set it aside, giving me his full attention in a way that immediately put me on guard. When my father focused on something completely, it usually meant trouble was coming. He had the same expression he'd worn when he'd caught me smoking behind the garage when I was 15, or when he'd discovered I'd been skipping calculus class during my senior year of high school. "So what's the plan, Ryan?" he asked, his voice deceptively casual. "You going to sit around here feeling sorry for yourself? Or are you going to do something about this situation? I have some meetings lined up," I said, which was technically true even if it didn't tell the whole story. "I'm not exactly starting from scratch here, Dad. I've got connections, references, experience. Finding another job isn't going to be impossible." Dad snorted, a sound that conveyed years of accumulated skepticism about my career choices and life decisions. "Another job," he repeated, like the words tasted sour. "You mean another position pushing papers around and pretending to be important while some rich boy pulls the strings behind the scenes?" He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest in a gesture I recognized from countless childhood arguments. "That's your problem, son. You keep thinking the system is going to work for you, keep believing that if you just work hard enough and play by their rules, they'll eventually give you what you deserve. But the game is rigged, Ryan. It's always been rigged. The only people who get ahead are the ones who own the game." I sipped my coffee and waited for him to continue. Dad had always been philosophical when he was angry, prone to delivering lengthy monologues about the injustices of capitalism and the futility of trusting authority figures. Mom used to joke that he should have been a union organizer instead of a construction worker, that he had the temperament and the speaking ability to rally people behind a cause. "You want to know what I think you should do?" Dad continued, not waiting for an answer. "I think you should forget about finding another job working for somebody else. I think you should take whatever savings you've got, whatever severance they gave you, and start your own business. Something real, something you can control. Maybe general contracting, maybe property management, something where you're the boss and nobody can fire you on Christmas Eve because their nephew needs a job." The irony was almost overwhelming. Here was my father, who'd spent my entire adult life criticizing my ambition and questioning my judgment, suggesting that I start my own business. He had no idea that I'd already done exactly what he was recommending, that Matthew's Development Group was going to close on its first major property acquisition in less than 3 weeks. He was giving me advice to do something I'd already accomplished, urging me to take risks I'd already taken. "That's not a bad idea," I said carefully. "Starting my own business has always been something I've thought about. The challenge is having enough capital to get started, enough connections to find good opportunities." Dad leaned forward, suddenly animated in a way I hadn't seen since Mom's funeral. "That's where you're wrong," he said. "You don't need millions of dollars to start a business. You need brains, determination, and the willingness to work harder than the competition. Everything else you can figure out as you go." He stood up from the table and walked over to the kitchen window, looking out at the snow-covered backyard where he'd taught me to throw a baseball and change the oil in my first car. The morning light made him look older than I remembered, more fragile somehow, but there was still strength in his shoulders and conviction in his voice. "I've been thinking about this for a while, Ryan. Even before yesterday happened. You've got skills that could translate into your own operation. You understand real estate, you know how to deal with clients, you've seen how these development projects work from the inside. Why not put all that knowledge to work for yourself instead of making somebody else rich?" I almost told him then. The words were right there, ready to spill out and transform this conversation completely. I almost explained about Matthew's Development Group, about the Riverside property, about Marcus Webb and Sarah Chen and the light rail extension that was going to change everything. I almost described the business plan we'd developed, the financial projections, the construction timeline that would turn 12 acres of abandoned warehouses into the most successful development project in Denver's history. But something held me back. Maybe it was caution, the instinct to keep my cards close to my chest until I was absolutely certain how the game would play out. Maybe it was pride, the desire to prove myself independently before asking for anyone's approval or support. Or maybe it was something deeper, a recognition that my father's advice came from a place of love, but also from a worldview that had never quite aligned with my own ambitions. Dad had always seen business ownership as a matter of survival, a way to escape the economic uncertainty that came with working for other people. I saw it as a path to something bigger, a chance to build wealth and influence that could last for generations. We were both right in our own ways, but we were playing entirely different games. You make it sound simple, I said, still testing the waters. But starting a development company requires serious capital, relationships with investors, connections throughout the industry. It's not like opening a restaurant or starting a landscaping service. Dad turned back toward me, and I could see frustration flickering behind his eyes. "There you go again," he said, shaking his head. "Making excuses, talking yourself out of taking any real risks. You sound just like your mother used to when she'd get scared about trying something new." Mentioning Mom was still a sensitive subject, and he knew it. She'd been the dreamer in our family, the one who'd encouraged me to go to college and pursue a professional career, even when Dad thought it was a waste of time and money. She'd also been the cautious one, the voice of practical wisdom that balanced Dad's tendency toward impulsive decisions. Mom wasn't scared, I said quietly. She was realistic. She understood that you can't just wish your way into success, that you have to have a plan and the resources to execute it. And look where all that planning got her. Dad shot back, immediately regretting the words as soon as they left his mouth. The cancer didn't care about her plans, Ryan. It didn't care about her college fund savings or her retirement account or any of the safe, sensible choices she made. Life is unpredictable, and the only security comes from being able to adapt when everything falls apart. We sat in silence for a few minutes, both of us thinking about Mom and the way her illness had upended every assumption we'd made about the future. She'd been 58 when the doctors found the tumor, healthy and active and planning for grandchildren she'd never lived to meet. All those years of careful financial planning and health insurance and regular checkups hadn't protected her from the randomness of cellular biology. "I need to get going," I said, standing up from the table and rinsing my coffee mug in the sink. "I've got that meeting this morning, and there are some other things I need to take care of today." Dad nodded, but I could tell he wasn't satisfied with how our conversation had ended. He wanted resolution, wanted to know that his advice had been heard and accepted, wanted some assurance that his son wasn't going to spend the next 6 months wallowing in self-pity and failed expectations. "Just remember what I said, Ryan. Nobody's going to hand you anything in this life. If you want something, you have to take it, and if you want security, you have to build it yourself." I drove across town toward Sarah's office, my mind churning through the implications of everything that had happened in the past 18 hours. Dad's advice about starting my own business wasn't wrong, but it was incomplete. He understood the importance of self-reliance and personal control, but he didn't grasp the complexities of modern development finance or the networks of relationships that made large-scale projects possible. Sarah's office was located in a converted warehouse in the River North Arts District, a part of Denver that had been transformed over the past decade from industrial wasteland into trendy creative space. Her consulting firm occupied the entire third floor of a brick building that had once housed a printing company, and she'd renovated it with the kind of clean, modern aesthetic that attracted young professionals and creative types. I found her in the main conference room, surrounded by architectural drawings and engineering reports that covered every inch of the long table. She looked up when I entered, and I could see immediately that she'd been working since dawn, probably since receiving the news about my termination from Peterson and Associates. "Ryan," she said, standing up to shake my hand with the kind of firm grip that had impressed construction foremen and city officials throughout her career. "I'm sorry about what happened yesterday. Peterson's an idiot, but I assume you already know that." Sarah was 34 years old, nearly 6 feet tall, with short black hair and the kind of confident presence that commanded attention in rooms full of men who weren't used to taking orders from women. She'd grown up in Sacramento, the daughter of Taiwanese immigrants who'd built a successful restaurant chain through a combination of hard work and strategic business decisions. Her parents had expected her to become a doctor or lawyer, but Sarah had fallen in love with civil engineering during her sophomore year at UC Berkeley. She'd moved to Denver 8 years ago to work for the city planning department, specializing in transportation infrastructure and zoning policy. Her work on the light rail extension had given her inside knowledge of the city's long-term growth plans, information that was invaluable for anyone trying to anticipate where development opportunities would emerge over the next decade. "Peterson's loss is our gain," I said, taking a seat across from her at the conference table, "assuming we're still moving forward with everything as planned." Sarah smiled, but there was something cautious in her expression that I couldn't quite read. "That's what I wanted to talk to you about," she said. "Marcus called me this morning. He's concerned about the timing, about how your situation with Peterson might affect our credibility with lenders and city officials." I felt my stomach tighten slightly. Marcus Webb's investment was crucial to the Riverside project, and I'd always known that our partnership depended partly on his confidence in my professional reputation. If he was having second thoughts because of my termination, it could jeopardize everything we'd worked toward over the past 6 months. What kind of concerns? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The project fundamentals haven't changed. The property acquisition is still on track. The zoning approvals are in place, and the market conditions are as favorable as they've ever been. Sarah nodded, shuffling through some of the papers on the table until she found what she was looking for. Marcus understands all that, she said. But he's also thinking about perception, about how it looks when one of the principals in a development project gets fired right before the deal closes. He's worried that people will assume there were performance issues, that maybe you're not as competent as your resume suggests. She handed me a printout of an email that Marcus had sent her earlier that morning. The subject line read, "Riverside Project, Risk Assessment Update," and the content was diplomatic but unmistakably concerned. Marcus had heard about my termination through his own network of contacts, and he wanted to discuss potential impacts on the project timeline and financing arrangements. "The reality is that your firing is already public knowledge in the development community," Sarah continued. "People are talking about it, speculating about why it happened, drawing their own conclusions. Some of those conclusions might not be flattering, and that could affect how lenders and contractors and city officials perceive our project." I read through Marcus's email carefully, noting the specific concerns he'd raised about our relationships with key stakeholders. He was right to be worried about perception, but he was also overreacting to what was essentially a personnel decision that had nothing to do with my competence or the viability of our development plans. "What does Marcus want to do?" I asked. "Is he suggesting we postpone the acquisition, or is he looking for additional guarantees about my involvement in the project?" Sarah leaned back in her chair, choosing her words carefully. "He wants to meet with both of us this afternoon to discuss options. He's not ready to pull out of the deal, but he wants to make sure we have a strategy for managing the reputational risks. He's also wondering whether it might make sense to restructure the partnership, maybe give me a larger operational role while you focus more on the development and planning side." The suggestion stung, even though I could understand the logic behind it. Sarah had an impeccable reputation in the Denver development community, and her background with the city planning department gave her credibility that I couldn't match, especially now that I was unemployed. From Marcus's perspective, shifting more responsibility to her might make the project seem less risky to outside observers. But Matthews Development Group was my vision, my project, my chance to prove that I could succeed independently of Peterson and Associates or any other established firm. The idea of stepping back into a secondary role, even temporarily, felt like accepting defeat before the real battle had even begun. "What do you think?" I asked, genuinely curious about Sarah's perspective. "Do you think my termination is a serious problem for the project, or is Marcus overreacting to office gossip and industry rumors?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the snow-covered streets below. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful and measured. "I think the firing itself isn't a big deal," she said. "People get fired all the time, for all kinds of reasons that have nothing to do with their competence. But I also think perception matters in this business, especially when you're trying to establish credibility for a new development company." She turned back toward me, meeting my eyes directly. "The question is whether we let other people's assumptions define us, or whether we take control of the narrative and prove them wrong through our actions. Personally, I think the best response to your termination is to make Riverside Commons so successful that nobody remembers or cares why you left Peterson and Associates." That was exactly what I wanted to hear, and exactly what I'd been thinking since yesterday evening. The termination was a temporary setback, not a permanent obstacle. The real test would be whether Matthews Development Group could deliver on its promises and establish itself as a serious player in the Denver development market. "So what do we tell Marcus?" I asked. "How do we reassure him that the project is still viable and that my termination doesn't change anything fundamental about our business plan?" Sarah gathered up some of the architectural drawings and rolled them into a neat cylinder. "We tell him the truth," she said, "that this is actually an opportunity, not a problem. You're no longer tied to Peterson and Associates, no longer constrained by their conservative approach to development projects. You can focus completely on Matthews Development Group and give it the attention it deserves." She stood up from the conference table and walked over to a large map of Denver that covered most of one wall. The Riverside property was marked with a red circle, and colored pins indicated other development projects throughout the metropolitan area. From this perspective, it was easy to see why the location was so attractive. 3 major highways intersected within 2 miles of the site, and the proposed light rail line would connect it directly to downtown Denver and Denver International Airport. Marcus is a smart investor, Sarah continued, tracing the light rail route with her finger. He understands that the transportation infrastructure is what makes this project special, not your employment status with some mid-tier development firm. The property acquisition is still happening, the zoning approvals are still valid, and the construction timeline hasn't changed. Everything that made this a good investment last week is still true today. I walked over to join her at the map, studying the network of transportation corridors and development opportunities that define Denver's growth pattern. The city was expanding westward and southward, following the natural geography of the Front Range and the economic logic of land prices and commute patterns. The Riverside property was positioned perfectly to capture that growth, to become a focal point for the kind of mixed-use development that young professionals and growing families were demanding. "There's something else," Sarah said, her voice dropping slightly as if she was sharing confidential information. "I heard through my contacts at the planning department that the light rail extension might be accelerated. Instead of breaking ground in 3 years, they're talking about starting construction next year. The federal transportation funding came through ahead of schedule, and the mayor wants to make it a signature project for his re-election campaign." This was huge news, the kind of development that could transform the entire timeline for our project. If the light rail construction started next year instead of in 3 years, the property values along the corridor would begin appreciating immediately. Our conservative projections were based on the assumption that we'd have to wait several years before seeing the full benefit of the transit connection, but an accelerated timeline would compress that appreciation period dramatically. "How certain is this information?" I asked, trying not to let my excitement show too obviously. "Are we talking about a definite decision, or just political speculation?" Sarah smiled, and for the first time that morning, she looked genuinely optimistic about our prospects. "Let's just say that I still have friends in the planning department, and they've been asked to expedite certain environmental reviews and preliminary engineering studies. Nothing's been announced publicly, but the pieces are definitely moving faster than anyone expected." This changed everything. If the light rail construction was accelerated, our Riverside project would benefit from the infrastructure improvements years earlier than we'd planned. The first phase of our development could open right around the time that rail service began, giving us a competitive advantage over other projects in the area. More importantly, it gave us a compelling story to tell Marcus and any other potential investors. We weren't just buying undervalued industrial property and hoping for the best. We were positioning ourselves ahead of a major transportation infrastructure project that would fundamentally reshape the entire corridor. The risks were minimal, and the upside potential was enormous. "What time is the meeting with Marcus?" I asked, already mentally preparing for the conversation we'd have with our primary investor. 2 o'clock at his office downtown," Sarah replied. "I suggest we put together a presentation that focuses on the accelerated rail timeline and what that means for our project economics. We can address his concerns about your employment situation, but I think the bigger story is about the opportunity we're positioned to capture." I spent the rest of the morning back at Sarah's office, working with her to update our financial projections based on the accelerated transit timeline. The numbers were even more attractive than our original conservative estimates had suggested. If the light rail construction started next year and service began within 3 years, our property would be generating positive cash flow from the transit connection almost immediately after our first phase opened. Marcus Webb's office occupied the top floor of a glass tower in the downtown financial district, with panoramic views of the Rocky Mountains and the sprawling metropolitan area that stretched eastward toward the plains. He'd made his fortune in real estate investment trusts and private equity, specializing in urban redevelopment projects that transformed underutilized properties into thriving commercial and residential centers. Marcus was 48 years old, originally from Chicago, with the kind of smooth confidence that came from decades of successful deal-making. He'd moved to Denver 15 years ago to take advantage of the city's explosive growth, and he'd built relationships throughout the development community that gave him access to opportunities that weren't available to smaller investors. When Sarah and I arrived at his office, Marcus was already reviewing our updated financial projections on his computer screen. He looked up as we entered, gesturing for us to take seats at the conference table that dominated one side of his office. Floor-to-ceiling windows provided a spectacular view of the downtown skyline and the mountains beyond. "Ryan," Marcus said, extending his hand with the kind of firm grip that suggested he'd sized me up and reached preliminary conclusions about my character and competence. "I'm sorry to hear about what happened at Peterson and Associates. James Peterson is a small-minded businessman who never understood the potential of the projects you were working on. I was surprised by the directness of his assessment and the obvious disdain in his voice when he mentioned Peterson's name. Marcus had never worked directly with Peterson and Associates, but apparently he'd formed opinions about the firm's capabilities and leadership that weren't particularly favorable. I appreciate that, I said, settling into my chair and preparing for what I expected would be a challenging conversation about risk management and reputation concerns. Obviously, the timing wasn't ideal, but I don't think it changes anything fundamental about our project or our partnership. Marcus nodded, but his expression remained serious.
That's what I wanted to discuss with both of you, he said.
The Riverside project is still attractive from an investment perspective, but I need to understand how Ryan's situation affects our relationships with lenders, contractors, and city officials. Perception matters in this business, and we can't afford to have people questioning our credibility right as we're trying to close the property acquisition. Sarah leaned forward, taking the lead in a way that demonstrated the partnership dynamic we'd developed over the past 6 months. We've been thinking about that exact issue, she said, and we believe Ryan's departure from Peterson and Associates is actually advantageous for our project. He's no longer constrained by their conservative approach to development, and he can focus completely on Matthew's development group. She opened her laptop and connected it to the large monitor mounted on Marcus's conference room wall. Within seconds, our updated financial projections were displayed in colorful charts and graphs that illustrated the potential returns from the Riverside project under various scenarios. More importantly, Sarah continued, we've received information that the light rail extension timeline has been accelerated. Construction could begin as early as next year, which means our property will benefit from the transit connection much sooner than we originally projected. Marcus's eyebrows lifted slightly, and I could see his attention sharpen as he absorbed the implications of this new information. The accelerated rail timeline was the kind of development that could transform a good investment into an exceptional one, and he was experienced enough to recognize the significance immediately. How reliable is this information? He asked, leaning back in his chair and studying the financial projections on the monitor. Are we talking about confirmed plans or speculation based on political rumors? Sarah had anticipated this question, and she'd prepared her answer carefully. I still maintain relationships with key people in the city planning department, she said. They've been asked to expedite certain reviews and studies related to the rail extension, which suggests that the timeline is being compressed for reasons that go beyond normal bureaucratic efficiency. She clicked through several slides that showed comparable transit-oriented development projects in other cities, demonstrating how property values appreciated once rail construction began and how that appreciation accelerated when service actually started. The data was compelling, suggesting that our conservative projections might actually underestimate the potential returns from the Riverside project. This is exactly the kind of opportunity I've been looking for, Marcus said, his tone shifting from cautious to genuinely enthusiastic. Transit-oriented development is one of the most reliable ways to generate long-term returns in real estate investment, especially in growing markets like Denver. He turned toward me, and I could see that his concerns about my employment situation had been overshadowed by his excitement about the accelerated rail timeline. Ryan, he said, I want you to know that your termination from Peterson and Associates doesn't concern me from a competence standpoint. I've reviewed your track record, and I'm confident in your ability to manage this project successfully. The relief I felt was immediate and overwhelming. For the past 18 hours, I'd been worried that my firing would undermine everything I'd worked to build with Matthew's development group. But Marcus's endorsement meant that our partnership was still solid, that the Riverside project could move forward as planned. What does concern me, Marcus continued, is making sure we have the right team structure to maximize our success. Sarah's reputation in the development community is impeccable, and her relationships with city officials could be crucial as we navigate the permitting and approval processes. I'd like to propose a slight adjustment to our partnership arrangement that reflects her increased importance to the project. I felt my stomach tighten again as Marcus outlined his proposal. He wasn't suggesting that I be removed from the project, but he wanted to restructure the partnership so that Sarah held a larger equity stake and more operational responsibility. Instead of my original 40% ownership, he was proposing that I hold 30%, while Sarah's stake increased from a consulting fee arrangement to 20% equity ownership. From a purely financial perspective, the change would actually benefit me in the long run. Sarah's increased involvement would make the project more likely to succeed, and 30% of a highly successful development would be worth more than 40% of a mediocre one. But the psychological impact was harder to accept. This was supposed to be my project, my chance to prove myself as an independent developer. What do you think, Ryan? Sarah asked, and I could hear genuine concern in her voice. She understood how important this project was to me, and she didn't want to accept a larger role if it meant undermining my position as the lead developer. I looked around Marcus's conference room, taking in the expensive furniture and the spectacular views that represented the kind of success I'd been working toward my entire career. This was what winning looked like in the development business: glass towers and million-dollar deals and partnerships with people who could write checks that most people couldn't even imagine. "I think it makes sense," I said finally, surprising myself with how calm my voice sounded. "Sarah's relationships and expertise are crucial to the project's success, and she deserves to be rewarded accordingly. As long as I maintain operational control of the development process, I'm comfortable with the adjusted partnership structure." Marcus smiled, extending his hand across the conference table. "Welcome to the big leagues, Ryan," he said. "I have a feeling that Riverside Commons is going to be the first of many successful projects for Matthews Development Group." As we shook hands, I realized that my father had been right about one thing. Security came from building something yourself, from creating value that nobody could take away from you with a termination letter or a budget cut. But Dad's vision of small-scale self-employment was just the beginning. Real security came from building something big enough to change the rules of the game entirely. The property acquisition was scheduled to close in 18 days. Construction would begin 6 weeks after that. Within 2 years, Matthews Development Group would own the most successful transit-oriented development project in Denver's history. And by the time the light rail service began, I'd be wealthy enough to buy Peterson and Associates outright, assuming it was still in business after Bradley Peterson finished running it into the ground. But first, I had to survive the next few weeks without letting anyone know how close I was to changing everything. The game was just beginning, and the most important rule was keeping your cards hidden until you were ready to win. The closing on the Riverside property happened on a Tuesday morning in January, 18 days after Christmas Eve. I sat in the law office conference room, signing document after document while the sellers looked nervous and Marcus looked satisfied. 12 acres of abandoned industrial property officially belonged to Matthews Development Group for $800,000, roughly 60% of what comparable properties were selling for just 5 miles closer to downtown. 3 months later, the first news story broke about the accelerated light rail timeline. The Denver Post ran it on page 1 of the business section, complete with maps showing the proposed route and artist renderings of what the completed system would look like. The headline read, "Mayor announces fast-track transit plan," and buried in the 4th paragraph was a mention of the Riverside corridor as a key development opportunity. My phone started ringing within an hour of the story hitting the newsstands. Reporters wanted quotes about transit-oriented development. City council members wanted to discuss zoning policies. Real estate brokers wanted to know if I had any property available for sale along the rail line. But the call that mattered most came from James Peterson. "Ryan," he said, his voice carefully controlled in a way that suggested he'd been practicing this conversation. "I hope there are no hard feelings about how things ended between us. Business is business, you understand. I'm calling because I heard through the grapevine that you might be involved in some development projects along the new rail corridor." I let him talk, enjoying the discomfort I could hear beneath his professional tone. Peterson had fired me on Christmas Eve thinking he was solving a personnel problem, but now he was realizing that he'd made a strategic error. The Riverside project was already generating attention throughout the development community, and my name was attached to it as the principal developer. "I'm always open to discussing potential partnerships," I said finally. "What did you have in mind, James?" Peterson cleared his throat, and I could imagine him sitting in his corner office, staring out at the city skyline and calculating how much money my success was going to cost him. "Well," he said, "Peterson and Associates has significant experience with municipal projects, and we have established relationships with many of the contractors and subcontractors you'll need for a development of this scale. Perhaps we could find ways to collaborate that would benefit both our organizations." The offer was pathetic and desperate, exactly what I'd expected from someone who'd suddenly realized he'd underestimated his former employee. Peterson and Associates was a mid-tier firm with limited capital and conservative management, precisely the kind of organization that would struggle to compete in the new transit-oriented development market. He needed me far more than I needed him. "I'll have my assistant send you some information about our current projects," I said. "If you see opportunities for collaboration, we can certainly discuss them. But I should mention that Matthews Development Group is pretty selective about our partnerships. We only work with firms that share our commitment to innovative design and sustainable development practices." Peterson agreed quickly, probably not even listening to the specific words I was using. He was focused entirely on finding some way to attach his firm to the success he could see coming. some method of participating in profits that should have been his if he'd been smart enough to recognize my potential while I was working for him. After I hung up, I walked over to the window of my new office in the renovated warehouse space that served as Matthews Development Group headquarters. Sarah had helped me design the layout, creating an open floor plan that encouraged collaboration while still providing private spaces for confidential conversations. The main conference room had a view of the Riverside property, which was already showing signs of the transformation that would make it the centerpiece of Denver's transit development boom. Construction had begun 6 weeks after the property closing, starting with the environmental remediation that would prepare the site for mixed-use development. Sarah managed the technical aspects of the project while I handled the financial and marketing components, a division of labor that played to both our strengths. Marcus provided strategic guidance and additional capital as needed, but he generally stayed out of our day-to-day operations. The first phase of construction was a modest office complex and retail strip that would establish our presence in the corridor while generating immediate cash flow. Nothing flashy or attention-grabbing, just solid professional development that would prove our ability to deliver on our promises. The real excitement would come with Phase 2, when we'd break ground on the residential component that would house the young professionals and growing families attracted by the transit connection. But the most satisfying part of the entire project wasn't the financial returns or the professional recognition. It was the phone call I received from my father on a Thursday afternoon in late March, just as the first buildings were taking shape on the Riverside site. "Ryan," he said, and I could hear something different in his voice, a note of respect that had been missing for most of my adult life. "I saw the article about your development project in this morning's paper. Sounds like you're doing pretty well for yourself." The article had been a feature story in the business section, complete with photographs of the construction site and quotes from city officials about the economic impact of transit-oriented development. My name appeared in the headline, and the story described Matthews Development Group as one of Denver's most promising new development firms. "Thanks, Dad," I said. "It's been a lot of work, but everything seems to be coming together the way we planned." There was a long pause, and I could almost hear him struggling with words that didn't come naturally to someone who'd spent his entire life believing that success meant surviving rather than thriving. "Listen, son," he said finally, "I owe you an apology. I was wrong about what happened at Christmas, wrong about what you were capable of accomplishing on your own." He cleared his throat, and when he continued, his voice was stronger and more certain. "I spent so many years being angry about my own limitations that I couldn't see your potential. Your mother always said you were going to do something special with your life, and I should have listened to her instead of letting my own disappointments cloud my judgment." The apology meant more to me than any professional recognition or financial milestone could have. Dad had always been a proud man who struggled to admit mistakes, and hearing him acknowledge that he'd underestimated me felt like a validation I'd been seeking for years without even realizing it. "You don't owe me any apologies," I said. "You were protecting me the only way you knew how, trying to prepare me for a world that doesn't always reward good intentions or hard work. But I think we both learned something important about taking calculated risks and building something that can't be taken away." The conversation lasted another 20 minutes, longer than Dad and I had talked in years, covering everything from construction techniques to business philosophy to memories of Mom and her unwavering belief in education and ambition. When we finally hung up, I felt like something fundamental had shifted in our relationship, some long-standing tension that had finally been resolved through mutual respect rather than argument. 6 months later, Peterson and Associates filed for bankruptcy. The official explanation cited market conditions and increased competition, but everyone in the development community understood what had really happened. James Peterson had failed to adapt to the changing dynamics of Denver's growth, had continued pursuing small-scale suburban projects while more innovative firms captured the transit-oriented development opportunities that represented the future of the industry. Bradley Peterson, the nephew who'd been hired to replace me, lasted exactly 4 months before being terminated for incompetence. The Henderson project that had supposedly justified my firing was eventually completed by an outside contractor at twice the original budget and 6 months behind schedule. The client sued for damages, and the resulting settlement consumed most of Peterson and Associates' remaining capital. I felt no satisfaction in Peterson's failure, just a quiet recognition that justice sometimes arrives through market forces rather than personal confrontation. He'd made a business decision based on nepotism and short-term thinking, and the consequences had played out exactly as economic logic suggested they would. My success and his failure were connected, but not in the way either of us had expected. The light rail service began operation on schedule, connecting the Riverside corridor to downtown Denver and the airport, with efficient, reliable transit that exceeded all the planners' original projections. Property values along the line increased by an average of 40% within the first year of service, and Matthews Development Group's holdings appreciated even more dramatically because of our early positioning and superior development quality. By the end of our second year in business, we'd completed both phases of the Riverside project and acquired 2 additional properties along the rail corridor. The company was generating annual revenues that exceeded anything I could have earned working for someone else, and my personal net worth had increased by more than 500% since that Christmas Eve firing that had seemed like the end of my career. But the real measure of success wasn't financial. It was the phone call I received from Sarah on a Friday afternoon in December, almost exactly 2 years after Peterson had delivered his termination speech in that fluorescent-lit office. "Ryan," she said, her voice bubbling with excitement. "The Planning Commission just approved our proposal for the Central Station project. 60 acres of mixed-use development around the main transit hub, the largest single development contract in the city's history." Central Station represented everything we'd been working towards since that first conversation in Sarah's office. It would be Matthews Development Group's signature project, the development that established us as one of Denver's premier firms and positioned us for expansion into other markets throughout the Rocky Mountain region. The financial returns would be enormous, but more importantly, it would be the kind of transformative urban development that shaped cities for generations. As I hung up the phone and walked over to the window of my corner office, I thought about that snowy Christmas Eve when my world had collapsed in the space of a single conversation. Peterson had thought he was ending my career, but he'd actually freed me to pursue opportunities that would have been impossible while working for his conservative, risk-averse firm. The irony was perfect in its completeness. Peterson had fired me to make room for his incompetent nephew, and that decision had ultimately destroyed his business while launching mine. My father had criticized my ambitions as unrealistic dreams, then watched those dreams generate wealth and recognition beyond anything his practical approach to life had ever achieved. Everyone who'd bet against me had lost, not because I'd fought them, but because I'd built something better than they could imagine. That evening, I drove through downtown Denver as the city lights reflected off the glass towers that housed the law firms and investment companies and development organizations that now considered Matthews Development Group a serious player in their industry. The light rail trains glided silently along their elevated tracks, carrying passengers between the residential neighborhoods and commercial districts that had grown up around our transit-oriented developments. At a red light, I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the contacts until I found Peterson's number. For a moment, I considered calling him, considered offering some gesture of reconciliation or professional courtesy. But then I realized there was nothing to say. He'd made his choice that Christmas Eve, and I'd made mine. The market had rendered its verdict, and that was justice enough. Instead, I drove home to the house I'd bought in the hills west of the city, a place with views of the mountains and the sprawling metropolitan area that stretched eastward toward the horizon. It wasn't flashy or ostentatious, just solid and well-built and entirely mine. The kind of security my father had always talked about, earned through work that couldn't be taken away by anyone else's decisions or judgments. As I pulled into the driveway, I thought about the cardboard box I'd carried out of Peterson and Associates that snowy night, the pathetic collection of personal belongings that had represented 5 years of professional life. That box was still sitting somewhere in Dad's house, probably forgotten in a closet or basement corner, a reminder of what failure looked like when you let other people define your worth. But failure and success were just temporary conditions, way stations on a longer journey that continued as long as you kept moving forward. Peterson had thought he was writing the final chapter of my story, but he'd actually been writing the first page of something much more interesting. The best revenge wasn't confrontation or recrimination, it was simply becoming everything they'd said you could never be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.